Good afternoon. Welcome to the first conversation in the Wallace Foundation series, Reimagining the Future of the Arts. I'm Bahia Ramos, the Director of Arts at the Wallace Foundation, where our mission is to foster improvements in learning and enrichment for children and the vitality of the arts for everyone. In our work, we seek benefits for the organizations we fund directly, as well as benefits for the field by developing and sharing credible, relevant knowledge. For more than 20 years, we've worked with arts organizations around the country, and our work has always been grounded in the belief of our co-founder, Lila Atchison Wallace, that the arts belong to everyone. That's what motivates us to play a small role in helping arts organizations remain a vibrant part of our social fabric. Today, the COVID-19 pandemic and the long overdue conversation about racial justice and more broadly equity present great challenges and opportunity. Our hope is in this series to share information and perspectives that help you to understand the context and gather ideas to inform your own thinking about how you might move forward. Over the past several months, Wallace has commissioned a range of studies aimed at providing insights into the visual and performing arts, as well as the audiences and communities that they serve. Over the next few months, we'll share what we've learned. Our goal is to provide insights that may help you shape your plans and expand your thinking about the possibilities for recovery and the sustainability of your organization and community. We're so glad to have on 1,180 of you joining us today to give you a sense of how this session will unfold. We'll first hear from Arthur Cohen, CEO and founder of La Placa Cohen, a New York-based strategic planning and marketing firm specializing in the arts. Arthur will walk us through several key findings from a special edition of Culture Track, Culture and Community in a Time of Crisis, a report co-developed with audience research firm Slover Linnet. Then, Lucas Held, the Director of Communications at Wallace, will lead a conversation with a group of nationally noted arts leaders who are working, as you are, to find a way forward. We'll get their thoughts about the implications of the Culture Track survey, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic fallout, and the racial justice movement. Our panel includes Kate McGuire, the Artistic Director and CEO of Berkshire Theatre Group, based in Massachusetts. The organization presents diverse, award-winning works on several stages and education programs that serve 13,000 school children throughout the Berkshires. In July, the theater staged a revival of Godspell, the first professional musical staged in the US since the shutdown. We'll hear more about that experience. Lisa Richards-Toney recently became the president and CEO of APAP, the Association of Performing Arts Professionals. She has more than 20 years of experience in the performing arts world, leading a range of small and large arts and humanities organizations, managing change and building stability. She most recently served as the interim executive director of the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. And Franklin Sermons is the director of the Perez Art Museum, Miami. Since joining the museum in 2015, he has overseen the acquisition of more than 1,000 works of art and pursued his vision of the institution as the People's Museum. Before joining PAM, he was the department head and curator of contemporary art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Menil Collection in Houston. During our conversation, we invite you to type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our panelists will respond to as many questions as possible later during the Q&A portion of our discussion. As a reminder, today's conversation is being recorded and will be available at wallacefoundation.org. You'll also be hearing from us via email with details on upcoming conversations, the next of which will be on Thursday, November 5th. Now let's get started with Arthur Cohen and Culture and Community in a Time of Crisis, a special edition of Culture Track. The study, the largest cultural survey conducted to date, surveyed more than 120,000 people nationwide during the pandemic with the help of 650 arts organizations. With that, Arthur, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bahia, and welcome everybody. Thank you also for including us in this wonderful and important gathering. We're really indebted to the Wallace Foundation for making this happen and honored to be a part of it. If we can go to the next slide, I'd also like to quickly thank, at the next slide, all the people who made this possible. First and foremost, if it weren't for Bahia and her foresighted colleagues at the Wallace Foundation, none of this would have happened. Their early and enthusiastic support made this important research effort possible, and we're greatly indebted to them, as well as colleagues at the Barr Foundation, Art Bridges, the Terra Foundation, Microsoft, Focus Vision, and many others. So thank you all for them. Thank you to all of them to make it possible. We want to tell you just a little bit about the survey, which many of you may have already seen some version of. We believe it is one of the largest, if not the largest, study about audience attitudes towards culture that has ever been conducted anywhere. As Bahia mentioned, it is vast in terms of the number of respondents, 124,000. And the way we reached these people was by reaching out to over 650 cultural organizations of all different scales, sizes, communities, and audiences throughout the country who distributed our survey to their lists. This occurred earlier this year, and a second wave will be occurring after the election and most likely in the first quarter of next year. Next. One of the first findings is an affirmation. As challenging as it is, it's important to quantify it, that given the fact that this is first and foremost a sample coming from the lists that organizations have of subscribers, donors, single ticket buyers, program attendees, and members, we see this thing that we call a representation gap, which is if we compare the racial and ethnic composition, self-identified, of these audiences coming from these lists versus the US population, we see, not surprisingly, but in a quantifiable way, a huge overrepresentation, 22% greater than the US population from census data within the white and Caucasian segment, and underrepresentations most significant in the Hispanic and Latinx communities and the self-identified Black and African American communities, which speaks to many of the issues that we are about to see in terms of a sense of inclusion, belonging, and connection. Next. One of the things I really want to emphasize is it was our goal throughout this study, with Wallace's encouragement, to be as diverse and expansive as we could be, to learn from previous art studies, which narrowed to specifically a very traditional audience so that we could have a much broader representation that looked like the United States and had a greater sampling of people across generations, races and ethnicities, and education and income levels from all parts of the country. Next. Let's first look at the direct impact that the COVID-19 crisis has had upon audiences and how it feels from them. And the first thing we want to essentially convey is that the toll has been extraordinarily intense from an emotional perspective. So the quickest way to look and understand this chart is whenever you see one arrow that's bigger moving in another direction than all the other arrows, as we see in the first two bars and the very last one, we see the type of change that is going on in terms of people's emotional predisposition. The questions that are asked are specifically cited on each page. So on this one, the question was simple. Compared to before the pandemic began, how do you feel now? And what we see are huge increases, particularly along the axis of being more worried and more afraid, more bored, and particularly on the other end, less connected to others. The sense of disconnection, dislocation, isolation was pervasive throughout many, many areas of the responses. Next. What do audiences want and expect from the cultural world right now? Because they have very specific and very acute needs, and it's important to identify the needs from their perspective. Next. We were able to aggregate the responses that we heard to a simple question about what kinds of things what roles do you want the cultural community to play, into four overarching categories. The first one being connecting and processing. Again, this whole idea of being connected to ourselves, to each other, to something more in the outer world, helping educate kids, bringing people of different backgrounds together. Another group about practical support, giving people information and advice to help meet the challenges of the everyday and know what recovery might look like. The next and the highest rated of all the attributes, emotional support, laughing, relaxing, having hope, and related attributes under escape, offering a distraction and escape from the crisis, and helping people switch the channel to focus on some topic other than the COVID-19 crisis so that they have something hopeful, positive, and energizing to think about beyond all of the challenges and anxieties that they are confronted with on a daily basis. Next. There's a great degree of interest in the emerging role of digital now that we have essentially shifted to a world in which our primary method and means of communication, as it is at this very moment, is through digital access. So what is the role of digital right now in terms of reaching and connecting with audience? Next. The first thing that we looked at is for cultural content that people are getting online, where are they going to get it? And what we see first and foremost in that big blue bubble in the middle is about 4 out of 10 say that the primary source that they're going to online is the artist or performer themselves. So this includes things like an Instagram live concert, a YouTube video, or other things that the artist or performing entity or creative entity is posting, followed in the degrees that you see in these other bubbles by different sources, including direct to the organization, such as 14% from performing arts centers, 10% from theater groups. What's really significant, and obviously is the hugest piece of work to be done from a cultural provider's point of view, is what's noted in this box, that overall, at least at this moment in time, only 13% of the 120,000 plus people we spoke to report paying for access to digital cultural content that they used. So these are people who are using the content, but the vast majority of them have not yet paid for it, thereby negating the opportunity for the organization to monetize that connection, which is obviously a huge financial objective going forward. Next. In terms of the kind of content that people seem to be using most, 2 quick questions of a bunch of activities. Which have you personally seen being offered, which is the pink bar? And have you done any of these things yourselves in the past 30 days? And what we see is the largest numbers come from things such as live stream performances, followed closely by online classes. And then if we jump to the middle, online materials for kids. So it's very interesting to see the kinds of needs that people are seeking, the benefits that they want to derive from cultural content that they are accessing online. Next. What kind of emotional benefit are they seeking? And this is quite interesting too. So what, if anything, did you get out of these activities? And what we see first and foremost is that correlated with what we've seen before, people just want to feel better, having fun, feeling relaxed or less stress, learning or experiencing something new, escaping the stress of the world. Next. This is one of the most interesting findings, which is these kind of little donuts. And in each of these donuts, the way to read it is that for each particular art form, that area in red indicates the percentage of people accessing content from that kind of cultural resource who has not physically visited such a resource in the past year. This is from 2019. So for example, we see that with art museums, 40% of the people who are accessing digital content from museums have physically not walked into a museum in the past year. And this represents a really interesting opportunity to perhaps view the digital audience as a growth audience for us. But it gets even more interesting from that. Let's go next. When we look more closely at those people who are accessing digital content, we see that it is a much more broad and less traditional audience than those who are typically associated with physical visitors. So, for example, of those using digital content from theaters, those who hadn't physically been to a theater in person in the past year were twice as likely to be Black or African American and twice as likely to have incomes below or up to $25,000. One of the most shocking results of the people using digital content from orchestras, those who had not been to a classical music venue in person in the past year, were 15 times more likely to be Black or African American, 3 times more likely to be Gen X. And finally, those for art museums were twice as likely to have at most a high school education or less, having not visited or physically been to a museum in the past year. Next. What about the future? What do people want and expect from us? Next. This is an interesting chart that essentially shows by art form on the bottom, correlated with each of these color codes in the box, the specific types of emotional attributes that people will be most seeking based on the type of cultural form. So for example, visiting a park, garden, or zoo, a very expansive museum, the primary benefit people seek is just to be immersed in beauty, followed by being a place that is fun and lighthearted and comforting, versus saying going to an art museum, which first again is about beautiful, but followed closely by being challenging or thought-provoking and also being emotionally powerful. So this essentially underscores the notion that the needs that people have from culture depend very much on the specific type of cultural experience that they are encountering. Next. I think at this point you've seen a lot of charts about the kinds of things that people need to see to make them feel more safe, more secure, more welcome or inclined to return. And what the point of this chart is that I just want to emphasize are the things that are to the left of the line. 6 out of the top 10 factors that influence respondents' decisions to return are things that are determined by your policies, that you yourself will determine, where the other 4 of these 10 are those that are determined by external agents, such as the availability of a vaccine or a government entity announcing that it is safe to return. Next. What are the types of changes that the audience wants to see in cultural organizations? Because almost everyone said that they do want to see change in cultural organizations. And these we were able to aggregate into 3 general types of benefits or needs. Needs that are related to being included and invited and more connected to the community, supporting local artists, being friendlier to all kinds of people, being more welcoming and engaging to the community. Needs relating to enjoyment, being more fun, less formal, more child-friendly, and needs that are related to connecting with oneself and one's life. Stories or content that connect to my life and more frequent new experiences that will nurture and inspire me. Next. I want to leave you with 3 verbatim quotes because at the end of this study, we simply asked people one very open-ended question and let them respond however they wanted, which is, what is the role of culture now in your mind? What should culture be? And here's a couple things that we thought were very powerful in their own words. The pandemic and our country's fractured responses to it, the magnitude of illness and death, all of these are almost unendurable. We need places and ways to gather and still have joy and pleasure in our lives. Places, even if virtual, to comfort each other, to feel human, humane, and normal. Next. It's nice to show that the arts and the cultural community is resilient enough to exist beyond buildings. It shows that between the institutions and visitors, the connection is still strong. And finally, our nation's chief problem during the last 50 years is its declining social cohesion. It seems as if the arts have a role here. This wasn't acknowledged before the pandemic, but would be vital as we move to a different existence within the worldwide community after the pandemic. Next. So these are really powerful thoughts that kind of trigger a whole new conception of the active role that the cultural community can play in people's lives at a time of need. So with that, I'd like to throw it over to our colleague, Lucas Held, who will introduce the conversation. Lucas?
Well, thank you very much, Arthur, for kicking us off so well with those insights from culture and community in a time of crisis. And I noticed in the chat there was applause for those great quotations, which really give us a sense of what's underneath that large number of 124,000 people. And it gives us a sense of kind of the texture of some individual thinking. So to help us make sense of these voices and what they suggest, I want to bring in 3 distinguished arts leaders. As Bahia mentioned, Kate McGuire, Artistic Director and CEO of Berkshire Theater Group, Lisa Richards-Toney, President and CEO of the Association of Performing Arts Professionals, fondly known as APAP, and Franklin Sermons, Director of the Perez Art Museum, Miami. As a reminder, the session will be recorded. And I think, Arthur, we can post the presentation along with that per the question in the Q&A. We'll also be doing a blog post about this later, so stay tuned. And as a reminder, please share your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom. And of course, feel free to chat. We'll be able to go to your questions around 1:45 and then end at 2. So let's begin. And as Arthur said, the survey found that even during this pandemic, people want arts organizations to play a meaningful role in those 4 areas of connection and processing, practical support, emotional support, and escape. So Kate, let's start with you. And as Bahia mentioned, you recently presented a successful outdoor Actors Equity approved COVID-safe theatrical production of Godspell for a live audience. And the Los Angeles Times called this a gutsy move. So tell us about the response to this gutsy move.
Thank you, Lucas, and thank you everyone at the Lila Wallace Foundation. I guess it was gutsy. Oblivious through most of the process is how I felt. The Berkshires is a cultural destination, as many folks know. Culture and arts is the primary industry here. And on a personal level, every doorway of growth in my life was opened through the theater. And we were going to do a production of Godspell before the pandemic hit. And so those 3 factors, the personal, the professional, and what it would mean to the Berkshires not to have any arts in the course of a summer, and ultimately the artistic product itself of being able to present this story, which is about a group of individuals who are each in their own chaos and try to find community. It felt like the story that should be told. And Equity was asking for submissions. We submitted a 15-page report on how we would keep everyone safe. We were denied. And then I spoke with several members of Equity and quite honestly felt like I was pleading for my life, for our organization's life, and for the community's life. And I don't know whether they took pity on me or what, but we began a 2-month process of working together to try to create a plan for safety. And on August the 7th, Godspell opened in the Berkshires. Audiences came. Production was sold out, as a matter of fact. Mind you, there were only 50 people allowed in the audience each night. But I have never, ever experienced theater in such a raw form. I often speak about being in the audience on opening night and watching people's heads drop. And I thought, oh my goodness, what's happening? And people were weeping because they were in the presence of music, of language, and of this story. It was incredibly powerful and really spoke to me again. Our organization is nearly 100 years old. I've been with the organization for almost 25 years. And all of a sudden, we were in the midst of really understanding what the arts mean to people's lives.
In such dramatic fashion. So let's turn to Franklin at the Perez Art Museum. You're temporarily closed, but you're thinking a lot about safety. How are you preparing?
Oh yeah, thank you, Lucas. And thank you everybody, Bahia and Aurelia, everybody at the Wallace Foundation. And so good to hear Arthur update us again with another culture track that keeps us on our toes and keeps us informed and gives us, a lot of food for thought. So we are now planning to open on November 5, barring setbacks. I like to say barring setbacks, of course. We've been closed since March 16, I guess that Monday. And like so many cultural organizations, pivoted immediately online to digital programming. But what you're going to see when we reopen, and I think this is in line with so many of our counterparts, especially within the museum space and the art museum space, is, we have areas that are, I think, open for a kind of social distancing that is going to be necessary. We are imposing some restrictions on that, of course, 250 people every couple of hours. We will be open for immunocompromised and seniors for the first hour of every day that we're open. You will have markings and symbols on the floor that will help direct your passage through the museum space. And I think what's been interesting for me to consider as someone who comes out of the curatorial conversation in many ways is, how do we think about the placement of art? How do we think about visual display in new ways that might even be innovative? I think that with one exhibition that we're opening with, it's called Allied with Power. And it's an exhibition that was supposed to be in half the space that it is. It's an exhibition of art from the African diaspora that happens to be, I think, pretty timely in light of so many of the other conversations around this period that we all have been dealing with. But that show will have art placed differently. It will give you a sense of space that also is part of the new kind of normal for how we're going to experience each other. For us being here in Miami, I know we talk often about, we've all had to find silver linings in these months, but outdoors is the new indoors in many, many ways. And so even as we approach the winter, we will make use of our sculpture garden in ways that we never have before, and that we have not, frankly, thought about with the emphasis that we will be now. So we're trying to I think, answer the demand that this moment has given us. I think one of the things that's really interesting for me in light of Culture Track and on some of the things we've talked about in the past is, for art museums, what we've been talking about a lot has been creating interactive experiences, creating opportunities for people to be hands-on with the work of art, not this kind of precious distancing. And, we have to change that. We're not going to set up the gallery space that we might have had in mind last year, where everyone will be sitting on a couch together and putting headphones on and interacting physically with the artwork. It's going to be a different type of interaction. And I think it's an interesting challenge that I'm really hopeful about meeting and seeing. So we'll be opening shortly.
Well, that's terrific. And I think the phrase you just coined, outdoors is the new indoors, really reflects well the spirit of optimism and adaptation that you're taking this. I want to step back for a moment, and Arthur, let me begin with you on this. So the Culture Track survey really helps us dig into the views of audiences. But we know that organization leaders need to think about a lot of other things: the art form, artists, budget, staff, boards, donors, the list goes on. Have you seen changes in how arts organizations are using the insights from Culture Track over since 2001 when this began?
We definitely have, Lucas. I think that of all those constituents and stakeholders you mentioned, historically, one could argue that the voice of the audience has been the one that has been least present in these processes and in planning processes. It's actually a somewhat novel idea to consider things from the audience perspective. So as such, what we've started to see is that some of the findings and some of the, most desired attributes sought in culture from audiences are working their way into kind of categories of strategic planning and visioning. And that the voice of the audience is now, happily, I believe, as much a part of the many perspectives that come into these future focused projects as any other stakeholder, as it rightfully deserves to be.
That sounds like a usefully provocative statement, that it's been a somewhat novel idea to hear from audiences and have them have them inform strategic planning, other activities. Let me get some reaction to that from Kate, Franklin, and Lisa. So Kate, what do you think of that? Is that correct? And unmute yourself.
The audience's voices became far more powerful this summer because well, first of all, we were only doing one production. And so normally in the course of 3 months, we're doing 8 productions. We were able to have very deep connection with the audiences. And I don't know that I will ever go back to the form that we were in before of doing 8 productions or 10 productions in the course of 3 or 4 months, because having that relationship with the audience is where we're supposed to be anyway. And this was a fundamental reminder of that, and that conversation that can happen. And also the conversation that can happen among staff and artists when you're purely focusing on, fewer projects, actually. I mean, just to be simple.
Well, that's really helpful. I want to bring in Lisa. And Lisa, I think it's hard to overstate the importance of performing arts centers. You represent 1,600 of them. So tell us how this resonates with you.
Well, absolutely, Lucas. And as everyone else has said, but I must add thank you to you and to Aurelia and the Wallace Foundation. It's an honor to be here with you today. The performing arts centers, like any business model in our country, is having to reckon with the reality that where we are. So the reckoning that has happened, so COVID created the storm that kind of leveled the playing field for us all. And then we had the Black Lives Matter movement, which came and set right at center and won't move. It won't move. And because it won't move, it won't move because we all have had the opportunity to actually exist on the same playing field. And so when you have that, institutions, performing arts centers have to look at their history, they have to look at their mission. And when people say, tear it all down, destroy it all up, and people get all very afraid, what that means in a very strategic boardroom conversation way is to really dig deep into what it is your purpose, is your strategy to get there. And once you have decentered whiteness, which is what this moment is also about, because you're decentering power or the elusiveness of power, you have to look at all of the structures within how you operate. You look at your programming, of course. So no longer are we doing the Black season in February or the Latina show in September. We are looking at equity as an opportunity to infiltrate all of what we do. So it shouldn't be a track. It shouldn't be a season. And that's a big change for a lot of organizations because you got to look at your mission. You got to look at your purpose. We also have to look at the audience, as all of we have said. Kate said it. We will never go back. The floodgates are wide open, internationally and locally. Community is not to be extracted. Community is not for the gain of a grant, a funding support. Community is integral to what we do. But did we say that in our mission statement is the question. We have to look at our boards of directors. What expertise do we now need at the table? It's not just about who can write a check. Keep the legacy giving. We got to get those checks in. But the new audiences that are showing up need to be represented in the boardroom as well. And so it's about expertise, but also characteristics. What kind of person do you need around the table to help you make decisions and survive in this world? The arts professionals that we all go to, our agents, people who are in charge of sponsorship, all of them, it opens the door for more opportunities there. No longer is there one way of access to success. And that is so liberating. It's difficult work, but it's a call to action that actually means something and will create the space for the arts to actually be in the public sphere that we know where we need to be. But we can't be there if we don't have these safe spaces, we don't have this real equity, because we will only be a siloed opportunity in our nation. So it's a big moment. And what's so exciting is that at APAP, we have the chance to help lead this, to bring our members along and to encourage people to learn more about how they can actually achieve these big, but yet very important goals.
Those are strong words. we will never go back. This is a big moment. I want to go to Franklin for reaction to that. And I'd note, Lisa, one of the fascinating things you did was really to sketch the ecosystem around performances, boards, artists, others. Franklin, what do you think?
On which aspects? The idea of I think engagement and audience and how we have moved within this time frame and how we have learned from the dual and parallel realities of COVID and of the Black Lives Matter movement. We have to be a little bit more creative. We have to be more innovative in terms of our audience outreach, in terms of our engagement. For us, that means a completely, not a totally different, but a renewed sense of customer experience, a renewed sense of engagement, a renewed look of how we value frontline staff, which is obviously a big part of this conversation. We're doing a lot of things where retail, visitor services, and all of the frontline experience is going to be, I think, acting on a more unified front, is going to take into account the conversations around diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion that we've all been talking about.
Have you encountered, Franklin, as you've sort of looked across the organization, have you kind of encountered any kind of barriers or things that might be tweaked, barriers removed?
Barriers in terms of?
In terms of the customer experience.
Well, I think one of the things that we've struggled with is, there's still a sense we are a youngish institution. When we talk about art museums, we're 35 years old. On one hand, there's this positive thing for me is that, we entered into this conversation in a moment not unlike this one, right? We were born in 1984 as an institution on the heels of yet another police killing, right? In 1979, you had the killing of Arthur McDuffie here in Miami. The subsequent trial played out the following year at exactly the same time as the Mariel boat lift. So our whole kind of where we come from is based upon a conversation around division and the idea that art and culture can bring people together, can be a place for really difficult dialogue and conversation. One that is led by a humanist approach, but one that is also open to very difficult conversations. And that we are doubling down on. So in order to do that, it's not for nothing, I think we have used that foundation as a point of departure always. So our new exhibition, Allied with Power, is not a response to the current moment. It is an exhibition that had already been in the planning stages. Likewise, there are installations by artists like Meleko Mogosi, born in Botswana. There are exhibitions like Polyphonic, an exhibition that is a show of selections that have been art that has been acquired through our Fund for African American Art, which has existed for the last 7 years. So it's not so much about the new initiative, but it's about really living up to the kind of things that we've talked about for a long time. And I think that's what museums are doing in this moment, because we've had these conversations. We've been out in front of the conversations for a long time. We've talked so much game. And now is the opportunity to live up to a lot of the conversations and things that we have said in the past that were important to us. And that means listening to audience. That means listening to frontline staff. That means expanding the idea of what art and culture can do for a wider public.
That phrase, living up to the moment, I think is very resonant. I want to turn to the question of where the living up happens. And that is to say, historically, visual and performing arts have been defined by their physical space. We go to a concert, we go to a museum. With this virtual engagement, I think Arthur raised the tantalizing possibility that it may be more diverse. How should we think about virtual engagement? Is it going to be an important part of work going forward? Is it going to change? Is it going to get more attention? How do we think about that? Who'd like to, and then who'd like to take a crack at that? And then very briefly, I'd like to ask Arthur, can that 13% number be moved? So anybody like to take a crack at the virtual question?
I could start just to finish, or no, Lisa, please.
Lisa, go ahead.
I'll start. I think this moment is also about the really looking closely at various business models that we've had in our industry and really assessing what's working for us and what's not. And the online world allows us to do so much more with our business model and just to really be very flexible. I mean, it's you know, sometimes people say, oh, well, are you now going to be serving people all over the world? Well, potentially. And so the opportunity to do should create now an obligation to change. So for example, at APAT, we've got our business model that we're trying to change is make more year-round programming. I mean, we're known for our conference. That's, you know, incredibly important, transactional, you know, for people to do business in this field. But how do we service those folks all year long? And the online capacity allows us to do it in a way that it's almost forced our hand. So, you know, while live streaming and, you know, for artists, you know, we haven't seen a lot of them making money yet, but people want to know, people are hungry and they, you know, they need to make money, that's for sure. But I think if we stick with it long enough, this hybrid way of doing business, it will just become another way. So the key is, as a business, like stick with it, learn who knows what, get close to them and try it out. The great thing about it is that we have the flexibility to try.
Right. Franklin, let me come back to you, but go to Arthur with that. So Lisa says that this pandemic has forced our hand. Is there any chance to for virtual experiences to yield revenue?
Yeah, well, I completely agree with Lisa. I mean, I think out of necessity comes this new opportunity. And when you think of it structurally, you know, historically in the cultural world, digital has been in service to the physical experience, object/performance. What we're looking at is a new reality in which digital exists alongside of that, not secondary to it. And there are opportunities that will emerge from that. I personally participated this past Saturday night in a performance that the Geffen Playhouse sent out to the world. I was one of 6,000 people paying $25 a head to see a magic show, which I experienced something which, you know, Kate and I share this. Yeah, there's nothing like being in a seat. Absolutely. But the thing that I experienced as one of those 6,000 people was some liminal state between digital and analog. I felt like I was a part of it. I knew I wasn't in a seat, but I also didn't feel like I was in some artificial netherworld either. So this is just the early shoots of these opportunities, but I'm super, super fascinated to see the types of innovation and ideation that will come from this, of really looking at digital in terms of new pathways to connection, new pathways to accessing audiences that perhaps you would never see walk through your door otherwise. And I know we had talked earlier, Lucas, about that 13% monetization figure. I think it is a historical reference right now. That is to say, that's the groundwork from which we will evolve. We have actually run that number from our study for specific organizations, including some of the largest, kind of most esteemed performing arts presenters in the country, where that number goes up to 40% in some cases. And our hypothesis about this is that the perceived value of the content that they're offering online is enhanced by their own reputation, by their brand, by the sense that what you get from them is worth more because it's special. And that's not just an advantage of scale. That could be an advantage, for example, going back to the Paras or another type of organization that has a very specific take on the world, that if you understand their take and value it, you may be able to express your value for it in terms of rewarding them through what you're willing to pay. And I think these opportunities, again, we're just seeing the beginning of it, but there's got to be something good that comes from this. And we believe that the evolution, the kind of jump starting in the creativity around digital content is really the next frontier.
So there is hope. And I think this also suggests the importance of learning about what works. We're going to have a lot of field learning about about effective strategies. And because most of these efforts, I'm guessing, will be local, there will be a lot to learn. We are now at the time for a Q&A. So what I'm going to suggest is we were going to do a quick round robin of our panel, but Lisa, Franklin, Kate, and Arthur, if it's okay, might I suggest that we hold that off for the end, and then we'll do a kind of lightning round from each of you with some reflections looking ahead. Does that work for everybody?
Sure.
Okay, terrific. There's so many wonderful. Let's now move to questions because there are there are so many of them here. One of the questions, and this was directed to you, Lisa, which is in a sense, how do you and Franklin and Kate, love you to weigh in here. How does one sort of open up space on the board for this discussion about the importance of community and as Arthur said, bringing the audience to the table? Any advice for the commenter?
That's a great question. My advice would be to weave it into your strategic planning conversation, which most boards are comfortable having. It's something you have at least a few times a year, at least once. And if it's because it is just that important, the key to this is to create accountability behind these goals. So if you want to have a more diverse board, which will help you to make more equitable decisions, more culturally relevant programming, and so forth, then you have to decide how much of this matters to me. Is this about 50%? You have to put a number to it, right? Because the accountability is what we're talking about. You have to do the same thing on your staff and with your programming. And that's something that we are exploring at APAP. How do we even model that? What does the accountability piece look like? Because our board is very diverse. It's one of the reasons why when I was hired, I felt so comfortable coming into this seat, because I knew I had the breadth of cultural diversity around the table that, there's not too often that I can present a point of view that isn't echoed, understood because of the diverse backgrounds of everyone who's at the table. Yeah, so you have to approach it from a strategic point of view. It has to be part of your ethos for how you're operating.
I want to go to Kate and then Franklin on this, because I think this really speaks to organizational change. And just a little bit of a commercial. On Thursday, we'll be releasing a scenario planning toolkit that does provide some opportunities to frameworks for strategic thinking looking forward. But let's go to Kate. I think this is a question both about the board, but about the dynamics of how do you actually operationalize the incorporation of audience views?
Well, in terms of the audience, I feel like we have a very powerful discussion going back and forth. I feel like the board is incredibly supportive. I live in Berkshire County, which is 85% white. And so the greater battle I feel that I'm trying to take on is, how do we educate an entire county? How do we speak with our politicians? How do we speak with our educators about diversifying a county and bringing and helping people to feel welcome here? That's the larger argument for us.
So you have advanced a kind of broad argument about the whole Berkshires and your place in it.
Yeah, and I sit on the business roundtable and am constantly bringing up this question in a room full of white individuals. What are we going to do? My children won't move to Berkshire County because of the way it looks.
So that connects this topic to something folks care about, which is the health, the future of the community. Franklin, what about you? You've been kind of a change maker in various organizations.
I think that, exactly picking up on what Kate said about making people feel comfortable. I think that is one very important thing. And as Lisa mentioned, targets in our relationship to strategic planning and our relationship to DAI is incredibly important. Well, for us, and I think for me, it's goes back to that conversation on how we were founded. This idea of being a place for people to come together and to provide a setting that is comfortable enough for people to have empathy, to be able to see each other in ways that are much more holistic and much more humanist than our normal daily lives normally allot. And I think that is very important in this conversation around board and staff, that it begins there, right? If we can't do it within our organization, then how can we possibly speak without? One of the things that I've found great sustenance in these last months is we have a all staff meeting every Monday morning, and that was once a monthly meeting, but in these times it needed to be weekly. And from, I don't know, maybe a month in, we decided that we would always have at least one board member present at the beginning of the meeting, telling them a little bit about themselves, getting to try and know people a little bit better. And so it's not forced us, but it has created a path for a greater degree of exchange and of learning from each other than we were able to do before, when everybody was running all over the place and physically unable to meet that way. People have made that kind of time and created that kind of space. And I think that collaborative aspect between board and staff is something that must extend into a greater community. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of us are going to double down on in this period. How do we, as museums who talk about being community centered, who talk about wanting to be a part of people's social lives, how do we then work with people who actually do that on a daily basis? So I'm excited about that.
That's really, really helpful. And I'm picking up this theme of, if you can't do it within, you can't do it. You can't do it without. So change, in a sense, begins at home. Arthur, wonder if you want to offer a quick comment, since I know you've done a fair amount of strategic planning. Are you? Is this resonating with you?
I mean, super quickly. This is really, when I was listening to Lisa, it really triggered, this observation, which is that, your DAI, DEI efforts, your health, safety, security and wellness efforts, and your visioning and strategic efforts, that's one thing. And the organizations that kind of divide and conquer these things, that's an old model. Okay, let's do the DEI stuff over here, and then I'm going to work on visioning over here, and then let's think about how we offer, health and wellness. It's all one conversation because it defines your relationship with your audience, with your community, with all of your stakeholders. And unless it's looked at holistically in an integrated way, it just doesn't happen. So I just want to focus on that.
And speaking of the ecology, we have a question from Joelle Worm about looking at equity at the training level. Is that something, I see Lisa, your head nodding. Is that an area that is important to think about as well?
Yes, the training level, and training early and often, not just the training, and we all have to be reminded of, we want to compartmentalize things. Okay, now we're going to do our training and check. Not so much. This work is dynamic. It changes. It's today. Anything could happen tonight. Not really, but we hope. So you've got to stay relevant, and you've got to check the temperature of your people, because it's about people showing up. Like Franklin was talking about, that exchange and how you can communicate and feel comfortable with one another has a lot to do with how you interpret this work. So training is essential, and there's so many trainers and good people out there. But I think it's the Performing Arts Alliance. I mean, they're trained. I mean, it's an ongoing expectation that as a board member there, I will be on this process all the time, because just like you're always looking over your monthly budget or you're always looking at your staff evaluation, you've got to always check your bias. You got to check what you understand about microaggressions and macroaggressions so that you can be, you know, you're not just talking about Black people. I'm a Black woman. It's not just about me. The Native Americans, the indigenous people, I've got to continue to educate myself. And we all do. So no matter where you sit, if you're in a rural community and it's 90% white, there's a place in it for you because we all start somewhere. And the best trainers understand that. They understand it's not about shaming, that it's about bringing people in. So.
And training is of course a form in education. And before we go to our round robin, JC Ayeva Leotis has a question about whether arts education figures into the equation of audiences. Kate, any thoughts on that?
On arts education, we certainly have kept going with our online classes, and because we serve so many kids in Berkshire County, it's the piece that we miss the most. I mean, we do productions with literally 100 kids in them, and the 100 kids are with us all summer long from all walks of life and from all areas of Berkshire County. So staying in touch with these kids has been critical, but it certainly is a piece of the pie that I don't feel we're being able to attend to as well as we normally do.
So Lisa and Franklin, is arts education in a sense part of connecting to the community? I'm seeing heads nodding.
You know, arts education was my world for many years. I mean, that's a big soapbox, but my answer is yes. And again, all of this work, you know, it shouldn't again rest with, you know, the social justice work, the work about moving the pen on these issues shouldn't just be for the arts education so we can do our community checkpoint, if you will. It's integrated. So the arts education people, yes, they need to be at the table and sharing their best practices, because a lot of the ways in which they work are the ways in which people are begging for. Yeah. It's putting the people first and letting the art respond to that.
And speaking of best practices, we've got 2 minutes. We promised to end at 2, so we're going into our lightning round, and then I'll offer a very brief close. So in maybe 20 or 30 seconds, what is your outlook for reimagining the future of the arts at this moment? And let me see if I can pick on Franklin first, then Lisa, Arthur, and Kate.
Well, I think in light of where we are today, in light of dealing with these dual pandemic situations, that the digital aspect that we have talked about is going to play an outsized role. We talked a little bit about the prospect of monetization. I think about a couple of examples. Last week, I was part of a collaboration with 3 other museums, the Wexner in Columbus, Michigan State, the Broad, the MCA Chicago, and ourselves. And it's called Connecting Through Collections. And we each are doing a conversation. Each director is doing a conversation. I followed great conversation with Johanna Burton, with one of our donors. In this case, I was speaking with George Perez. And to have this kind of collaboration, create this environment in which we all are tuned into each other at exactly the same time, all sitting on a webinar like this, and sharing our stories and sharing who we are and the differences between us has been incredible. And I think that kind of aspect will continue. On the other hand, in the pivot, for us, we have an auditorium that seats about 250 people. Now, when I did the first conversation with Jerry Saltz after our closing, we had up 3 times that amount of people. So physically, it would not have been impossible to do what we did alone in the space. And the quest moving forward is, how do we divide between the physical and the virtual? And I think that there will be a dual component to that, and for us in most events.
I appreciate that dialectical view of the virtual and the real, and I think that that's going to be a reality. I very quickly, and I'm sorry,
Sorry.
no, the clock told 2. So let's go to Lisa, Arthur, and Kate very briefly. Your outlook on reimagining.
I'm really excited about the advocacy potential we have as a field. I'm excited that we can look at our opportunity to come together as a full ecosystem, nonprofits, for-profits, and all of the various business models that exist within, where we can advocate together, make our case statements larger, and impact change in that way. And when we are not represented, there'll be times that someone will lead the charge and we'll have to sit behind, but we still have to raise our hand in support of that because it's a circle. We're nowhere without each other. And I think we're getting there, and we will continue to try and put forth legislation that makes that happen. And I'm really excited for what the future could hold for that. And I hope we'll continue to work toward it.
Terrific. Thank you, Kate, and then Arthur.
I would just say that we have to work together. One of the proudest moments of Godspell for me were when I was speaking directly to the actors on the stage. 10 young artists whose lives were fundamentally changed by what they recognized during that performance time. They will never be silent again. They will speak on stage and off stage. And that is what is so critical right now, is for us to remember that we have the power of language and communication, whatever art form we're in.
Wow, got goosebumps. Arthur.
Well, let me answer your question with a question for the hundreds of people listening in. Imagine that the end of the name of your organization was "and center of community." How would it be different from what it is today? Because that's your greatest opportunity going forward. Fusing that specific cultural expertise that you have with this new level of connection, dialogue, engagement, invitation to the community that surrounds you.
Thank you, Arthur. And let me again thank Lisa Richards, Tony, Franklin Sermons, Kate McGuire, Arthur Cohen, Bihir Ramos, our Aurelia Grayson, our ACE team, including Madison Richards, May Wijaya, Amy Goodall, Douglas, and Christine Yoon for their work on this. Please do join us for the next session, Thursday, November 5th at 1 p.m. And we will be sending you all a very brief survey following this session. We promise it's only a couple of questions, and if you have an extra minute, we hope you'll participate. It will help us shape future sessions. And the next session on Thursday, November 5th at 1 p.m., Zani Voss, Director of SMU Data Arts, will present findings from her research, The Alchemy of High-Performing Arts Organizations. And as a reminder, this webinar was recorded. It'll be available on the Wallace website along with the presentation from Arthur, and a blog post will be ready in a couple of weeks. Thank you, everybody. Thank all of the 600 plus folks who joined us. And we're very grateful to you and the extraordinary conversation in the chat. We'll try to get back to some of you individually on some specific questions and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you very much.